The silence was the loudest sound in the empty apartment. It screamed from the bare walls where photos once hung, echoed on the floorboards where a child's laughter used to bounce. Helen stood in the middle of the living room, a solitary island in a sea of dust motes dancing in the last sliver of afternoon light. The air was thick with the ghost smell of their life, faint traces of her husband Mark's aftershave, the lingering aroma of yesterday's meager soup, now overpowered by the chalky scent of dust and finality. 6 months. It had been 6 months since the phone call that had cleaved her life in two. Now, the landlord's final, unsympathetic words still rang in her ears, sharper than the screech of the mover's truck as it pulled away. Her 8-year-old son, Leo, sat quietly on the single remaining cardboard box, his small legs dangling, not quite reaching the floor. He wasn't crying. That, somehow, was worse. He just watched her, his eyes wide and uncertain, a silent question hanging in the heavy air between them. Helen felt a tremor start in her hands, a physical manifestation of the terror that had taken root in her gut. She forced the tremor down, her movements stiff and deliberate as she reached into the pocket of her thin coat. Her fingers brushed against the worn leather of her wallet. Opening it felt like opening a wound. Inside lay the entirety of their world. 4 $20 bills, 1 5-taus, 2 1s, and a small handful of change she had scraped from the bottom of a kitchen jar. She tipped the coins into her palm, the metallic clink painfully loud in the silence. $87. She counted it again. $87.35. The number was an insult, a cruel joke. A dull, gnawing ache started in her stomach, the familiar pain of hunger sharpening into the acute pang of fear. How many meals was that? How many nights in the cheapest, grimiest motel before it was all gone? She looked at Leo, at the pale fragility of his small face, and the hunger in her own belly was replaced by a nauseating wave of panic. Her heart clenched so tightly it hurt to breathe. He was depending on her, and she had nothing, absolutely nothing. She was failing him, and the shame felt like a physical weight. A memory ambushed her, sharp and unwelcome. Mark, coming home from the factory, his clothes smelling of sawdust and sweat, scooping Leo into the air, his calloused hands, always so gentle with her, holding her face as he promised they'd save up, that one day they'd have a little house of their own. The memory was so vivid she could almost feel the warmth of his arms, a warmth that was stolen by the chillingly sterile voice of a company official on the phone. "There's been an accident," the voice had said, devoid of any emotion, a malfunction, a tragedy. But his co-workers had whispered. They had used another word, suspicious. The word had lodged in her mind like a splinter, a painful, festering question she couldn't afford to examine. There was no time for suspicion when grief was a physical weight pinning you to the bed. There was no room for questions when the bills began to pile up like headstones. Now, the weight of those 6 months, of fighting and failing, pressed down on her, squeezing the very air from her lungs. Justice was a luxury. Survival was a brutal necessity. Her gaze fell upon the two things in the room that were still theirs: Leo, her anchor and her terror, and, next to him, the heavy, black case of her old sewing machine. It was a Singer, a workhorse from another era, inherited from her mother. Its weight was a familiar burden. She ran a hand over the scuffed faux leather of the case, the cold plastic handle digging into her palm. Inside rested the intricate metal beast that was her only marketable skill. She had dreamed of opening a small alterations shop, of the satisfying hum of the machine as it stitched fabrics and futures together. Now, it was just another heavy object to haul into homelessness. It represented a future she could no longer see, a path that had been washed away in the flood of her misfortune. The sun dipped below the opposite rooftops, and the sliver of light in the room vanished, plunging them into a deep, chilling twilight. The shadows that stretched across the bare floor seemed to grab at her ankles, pulling her down into the cold, hard reality of their situation. Night was coming, and with it, a cold she felt deep in her bones. Taking a deep, shaky breath that tasted of dust, Helen walked to the door. She picked up the sewing machine, the handle groaning under the weight. "Come on, sweetie," she whispered, her voice raspy. Leo slid off the box and took her free hand, his small fingers wrapping tightly around hers. His touch was the only warmth in the world. She didn't look back. She couldn't. She pulled the door shut. and the click of the lock was a sound of absolute finality, a metallic tombstone on a life that was now over. They stood in the building's hallway, the fluorescent lights humming overhead, casting a sickly yellow glow on their pale faces. "Mom?" Leo's voice was a tiny thread of sound in the oppressive silence. "Where are we going?" The question struck her with the force of a physical blow, and nausea rose in her throat. She looked down at his trusting face, and for a terrifying second she had no air, no words, no answer. Forcing a strength she didn't possess, she squeezed his hand and stepped toward the exit, pushing the heavy door open into the cold, indifferent city night. They were utterly, terrifyingly alone. They spent 2 nights in a motel that smelled of bleach and desperation, the $87 shrinking with an alarming speed. On the 3rd day, a lifeline. The phone in the musty office rang for her. It was Dave, a man who had worked with Mark at the mill, his voice crackling with distance and awkward sympathy. He'd heard what happened. He was sorry. Then, a hesitation. He said he remembered Mark mentioning his family had some old property, way out of town. Just a patch of dirt, really, with a barn on it. Nothing official, no papers he knew of, but no one had been near it in decades. It was nothing, he repeated, probably a ruin. But as Helen listened, the word ruin was drowned out by the words property and barn, a place to go, a roof. A fragile, impossible seed of hope began to sprout in the barren wasteland of her heart. She felt a warmth spread through her chest for the first time in days, a dangerous and exhilarating flicker of possibility. It was theirs, or at least, it was no one else's. And that was more than enough. The bus ride was a long, rumbling journey from one kind of desolation to another. They left the familiar grey grid of the city, its concrete towers shrinking in the grimy rear window, and plunged into a landscape of sprawling, monotonous farmland. Helen clutched her purse, the bus ticket having taken a significant bite out of their remaining funds. Leo, exhausted by the stress he couldn't name, had fallen asleep, his head a heavy, warm weight against her arm. She stared out at the endless fields of corn and soy, the occasional farmhouse a lonely island in a sea of green. In her mind, she painted a picture of the barn. She imagined it sturdy and welcoming, smelling of old wood and sweet hay, a place where she could set up her sewing machine by a large, open door, the sound of its needle, a comforting hum against the chirping of crickets. She pictured Leo playing safely in the sunshine, his laughter finally returning. This sliver of land, this forgotten inheritance, became a canvas for all her depleted dreams. They were deposited at a dusty intersection with a single, blinking yellow light. The bus pulled away in a cloud of diesel fumes, leaving them in a profound and unnerving silence, broken only by the hum of insects in the tall grass. The address Dave had given her was for a rural route, and a weathered farmer at a roadside stand pointed them down a long, unpaved road. "Miller Place. Ain't nobody been out there in my lifetime," he'd said, his eyes lingering on Leo with a look of pity. The sun was high and unforgiving, beating down on Helen's head. The sewing machine, which she now carried, felt like it was filled with lead, its handle cutting into her fingers. Each step sent a jarring ache through her arm and shoulder. The air was thick and humid, smelling of hot asphalt and pollen. With every 100 yards, the hope that had buoyed her on the bus began to feel thin and brittle, stretched taut by the heat and the oppressive, lonely quiet of the countryside. She was starting to feel exposed, vulnerable. "Are we almost there, Mom?" Leo's voice was small, tired. He trudged beside her, kicking at stones on the gravel path. His face was flushed with heat, a sheen of sweat on his forehead. Helen forced a smile, a painful stretching of her lips. "Almost there, sweetie. It's going to be a big adventure." The lie tasted like ash in her mouth. Her own body was screaming in protest. Her back ached, her feet throbbed, and the gnawing hunger in her stomach had returned with a vengeance. She could feel the last few dollars in her pocket, a weight that was both trivial and monumental. She had gambled everything on this. The memory of the landlord's sneering face, the cold finality of the apartment door clicking shut. It all propelled her forward. There was no going back. This had to be the place, and it had to be their salvation. She had allowed herself to hope, and now the terrifying consequence of that hope being misplaced was a physical dread coiling in her gut, as heavy and unyielding as the sewing machine in her hand. They finally reached the end of the overgrown dirt track, a path so forgotten it was barely a scar on the land. And there it stood, the barn. But the image Helen had clutched in her mind, a rustic red-painted structure, weathered but sturdy, shattered into a million pieces. What stood before them was a skeleton, the carcass of a building picked clean by time and neglect. The corrugated tin roof sagged precariously in the middle, looking as if a strong wind would peel it back like a can lid. The grey, weathered wooden walls leaned at a drunken angle, with boards missing like lost teeth, revealing the dark, hollow interior. A wave of cold, hard reality washed over Helen, so powerful it stole her breath. Her stomach, already tight with anxiety, plummeted. This wasn't a shelter. It wasn't a fresh start. It was a grave marker for a hope that had only been born 2 days ago. She felt Leo's small hand tighten in hers, and the weight of his unspoken fear was heavier than the sewing machine she had carried for miles. Her legs, numb with exhaustion, carried her forward as if in a trance. She dropped the sewing machine near the entrance, the thud muffled by the overgrown weeds. The main door, a massive slab of wood, hung from a single rusted hinge, tilted at a grotesque angle. It wasn't a door, it was a wound. As she drew closer, the first wave of scent washed over her, and she flinched, bringing a hand to her nose. It was the smell of profound decay, a thick, cloying odor of damp, rotting wood, of years of animal droppings, and underneath it all, a sharp, pervasive stench of mildew that seemed to coat the back of her throat. This wasn't the sweet smell of old hay and earth she had imagined. This was the smell of death, the death of a building, the death of vegetation, the death of her desperate, fragile hope. She felt a surge of nausea, and her eyes watered, a reaction to both the putrid air and the sudden, overwhelming despair that gripped her. She had led her son here, to this. Stepping through the broken doorway was like entering a tomb. The air inside was heavy and stagnant, several degrees cooler than the sun-baked world outside. It was a damp, suffocating cold that seemed to cling to her skin. Her eyes struggled to adjust to the gloom. Sunlight didn't filter in gently. It pierced through the darkness in sharp, invasive beams, slicing through the gaping holes in the roof. These columns of light illuminated a chaotic ballet of dust motes, insects, and floating bits of desiccated leaves. The barn was larger on the inside than it appeared, but the space offered no comfort. It was a vast, echoing cavity of failure. The sheer scale of the neglect was overwhelming. Every surface was coated in a thick layer of grime and cobwebs, so dense they hung like funeral shrouds from the high rafters. Helen could hear the scuttling of unseen things in the shadows, the drip, drip, drip of water from a recent rain, and the low moan of the wind as it slipped through the broken walls. She took a tentative step, her shoe making a soft, sinking sound. She looked down, and her heart seized. The floor was a minefield. What had once been thick wooden planks was now a treacherous patchwork of decay. Entire sections had rotted away completely, leaving dark, gaping holes that led to the dirt and rock below. Other boards, though appearing solid, were dark with moisture and bowed under their own weight, promising to give way at any moment. The thought of Leo running, of him taking a single wrong step, sent a jolt of pure terror through her. This wasn't just a ruin, it was a death trap. She imagined his small body falling through the rotten wood, the sound of his cry echoing in this awful place. The fear was a physical thing, a cold hand squeezing her heart. She immediately grabbed Leo's hand, her grip iron tight. "Stay right next to me," she commanded, her voice a harsh whisper. "Don't move." The adventure was over. This was a nightmare. Her eyes scanned the space, desperate for a single redeemable feature, one small sign that this wasn't a complete catastrophe. Her gaze landed on a large pile in the far corner, the one thing Dave had mentioned specifically, the hay. In her mind, it had been a soft, golden mattress, a place to sleep, a small comfort. The reality was a grotesque parody. The pile was a compacted, semi-petrified mass, blackened and fused together by years of moisture and rot. It wasn't hay. It was a geological formation of decay. Wiry, dark weeds grew out of its surface. As she stared, she saw movement. A fat rat, sleek and unafraid, emerged from a hole in the mass, regarded them for a moment with its beady eyes, and then disappeared back into the filth. The sight broke something inside her. The last tiniest ember of hope was extinguished, drenched by the foul reality of this place. The hay wasn't for sleeping. It was a nest, a teeming ecosystem of vermin and rot. It was utterly, hopelessly useless. The full weight of their isolation crashed down on her. Standing in the center of the decaying structure, she turned in a slow circle. There was no light switch on the wall. There was no spigot for water, no sign of plumbing, no wire for electricity. There was nothing, just the four leaning walls, a leaky roof, and a rotten floor. They were miles from the nearest road, with no vehicle, and a handful of dollars to their name. This wasn't a step up from homelessness. It was a deeper, more isolated circle of hell. On the street, there were people, there were public fountains, there were shelters one could try. Here, there was nothing but the vast, indifferent sky and this monument to failure. The silence pressed in, a physical weight on her eardrums. She felt a terrifying sense of being completely untethered from the world, a castaway on an island of squalor. Her plan, born of desperation, had been a fool's errand. She had led them to a place worse than the one they fled. A profound, bone-deep exhaustion washed over her, heavier than any physical fatigue. It was the exhaustion of a soul that had fought and lost one too many times. The adrenaline that had propelled her for days, the frantic energy of survival, suddenly drained away, leaving a hollow void in its place. She felt hollowed out, a fragile shell. The what-ifs began to swarm in her mind. What if she had begged the landlord? What if she had sold the sewing machine? What if she had called a social service agency and risked having Leo taken from her? Every choice, every path, seemed to have led to this exact moment of utter ruin. The barn seemed to mock her, its broken rafters like a jeering grin, its shadows like accusing fingers. She had promised her son an adventure, and she had delivered him to a place of filth and danger, a place where hope came to die. The shame was a burning acid in her stomach. She had failed, completely and irrevocably. Her knees buckled. She didn't so much kneel as collapse onto a section of floor that seemed marginally less rotten than the rest. The impact sent a jolt of pain up her legs, but she barely felt it. The fight was gone. The strength she had been forcing, the brave face she had been wearing for Leo, crumbled into dust. A sound escaped her lips, a raw, ragged sob that was torn from the deepest part of her. It was a sound of absolute brokenness. The tears she had suppressed for weeks, through the funeral, the eviction, the long nights staring at the ceiling, finally came. They weren't silent, noble tears. They were a flood of ugly, gasping cries, hot and unstoppable. They streamed down her face, tracing paths through the grime of the journey, a physical manifestation of her complete and total despair. She wrapped her arms around herself, rocking back and forth, the sound of her own sorrow echoing in the vast, empty barn. Leo, who had been standing frozen and silent, took in the sight of his mother's complete collapse. His own fear, which had been a quiet background hum, now crescendoed into a wail. He ran to her, his small body trembling, and threw his arms around her neck. "I'm scared." "Mommy," he sobbed, his tears soaking the collar of her shirt. His small voice, filled with a terror that mirrored her own, was the final blow. Hearing his fear, knowing she was the cause of it, was an unbearable agony. She hugged him tightly, her own sobs catching in her throat, her body shaking uncontrollably. They clung to each other, two small, shipwrecked souls in a sea of rot and decay. The false hope of the barn had been crueler than no hope at all. It had lifted her just high enough to make the fall shatter her completely. Here, in the damp, stinking darkness, surrounded by vermin and failure, Helen reached the absolute bottom. There was nowhere left to fall. She held her son, her cheek pressed against the top of his head, smelling the familiar scent of his hair mixed with the sour air of the barn. Her crying subsided into shuddering, ragged breaths. The initial, violent storm of despair had passed, leaving behind a cold, heavy fog of hopelessness. She looked around the decrepit space, her eyes now accustomed to the gloom. The shafts of light had shifted, lengthening across the floor, highlighting the filth and the decay in excruciating detail. It was worse than she could have ever imagined. It was a place devoid of warmth, of safety, of dignity. For a long, terrifying moment, she felt nothing. Not sadness, not anger, just a vast, echoing emptiness. The future was not a path, not even a dark one. It was a wall, a solid, insurmountable wall of black. She had no money, no home, no plan. She and her son were trapped, and the world had utterly forgotten them. In that moment, the true weight of her husband's death settled on her not as grief, but as a practical, brutal absence. Mark would have known what to do. He would have been able to patch the roof, to reinforce the floor, to make this place livable through sheer force of will and know-how. He would have looked at this ruin and seen a challenge. She looked at it and saw only an ending. The loneliness was an ocean, and she was drowning in it. She closed her eyes, the tears leaking from beneath her lids. The image of the city street, which had seemed so terrifying 2 days ago, now felt like a paradise lost. At least there was life. Here, there was only the slow, silent process of decomposition. She squeezed Leo tighter, a primal, protective instinct overriding the despair for a fleeting second. She had brought him to the bottom of the world, and as the sun began to set, painting the sky in colors of orange and purple that she couldn't see through the grime, she had no idea how they would ever climb back out. Night bled into the barn, not as a gentle fading of light, but as an encroaching, physical presence. The sharp blades of sunlight through the roof were replaced by a deep, uniform gloom that swallowed every corner. The air grew colder, a damp chill that seeped through Helen's thin coat and settled deep in her bones. She could hear the barn coming alive with its own nocturnal rhythm. The wind moaned through the gaps in the walls, a lonely, mournful sound. Above, the rusted tin roof would occasionally groan and pop, as if the whole structure was sighing in its sleep. Helen's despair had cooled into a hard, dense knot in her stomach. She knew she couldn't stay collapsed on the floor. Leo needed her. He was shivering, his small face a pale smudge in the darkness. They needed a place to lie down, a corner to carve out of this sprawling rot. Her body screamed with fatigue, but the primal need to protect her son was a current, however weak, pulling her back to her feet. The fight wasn't over. It couldn't be. She guided Leo toward the far wall, the one that seemed most intact, where the wind's wail was slightly muffled. "We'll make a spot here," she whispered, her voice sounding unnaturally loud in the vast, quiet space. "Just for tonight." The area was covered in the same filth as everywhere else, a compressed layer of ancient, rotted vegetation, dirt, and things she didn't want to identify. Using her hands, she began to scrape at the surface, trying to clear a small patch down to the wooden floorboards. The work was disgusting. The material was damp and cold, and it smelled foully of earth and decay. With every handful she pushed aside, a small cloud of spores and dust would rise, catching in her throat and making her cough. Leo, seeing his mother work, began to help, kicking at the edges of the compressed mass with his small, worn-out sneakers. He was trying to be brave, trying to turn this horror into a game, and the sight of his effort sent a fresh pang of love and guilt through Helen's exhausted heart. They worked in the deepening twilight, two small figures against the immense gloom of the decaying structure. Helen felt a grim, mechanical rhythm take over. Scrape, push, breathe. Don't think about the smell. Don't think about the scurrying sounds in the shadows just beyond their small circle of activity. Don't think about tomorrow. Just this patch of floor. Just this single miserable task. Her fingernails were soon caked with dirt, her hands numb from the cold, damp filth. She uncovered a small area, maybe 4 feet by 6, exposing the dark, stained planks beneath. It wasn't clean, not by any stretch of the imagination, but it was a space, a defined area of misery that they could, for the moment, call their own. She sat down, her back against the rough, splintery wall, and pulled Leo close, tucking him under her arm. The cold was relentless. Sleep felt impossible. Her mind was a whirlpool of fear, circling the drain of their hopeless situation. She just stared into the oppressive darkness, listening. Leo, however, was restless. The nervous energy of a terrified child couldn't be contained by simple exhaustion. He wriggled out from under her arm. "I'm helping," he declared, his voice a small defiance against the suffocating silence. He went back to the edge of the cleared space and started kicking at the compacted hay again, his movements jerky and angry. "Leo, stop! Come here!" Helen said, her voice flat with fatigue. But he ignored her, his frustration finding an outlet in the repetitive thud of his shoe against the rotten mass. Thud, thud, thud. Then a different sound, a hollow clack, followed by a yelp. "Ow!" Leo stumbled back, holding his foot. Helen was on her feet in an instant. her heart lurching with a fresh spike of fear. "What is it? Are you hurt?" She rushed to his side, her hands frantically checking his ankle. He hadn't twisted it. His foot had just snagged on something hard, something that wasn't supposed to be there, hidden just under the thinnest layer of filth. "Something's loose," Leo mumbled, pointing a shaky finger at the spot. He was more surprised than hurt. Helen's eyes followed his gesture, where his foot had kicked. The compacted surface layer had been scraped away, revealing the floorboard beneath. But it wasn't flat like the others. One end was slightly raised, a dark edge sticking up by less than an inch. A loose floorboard. In any other circumstance, it would be just another sign of the barn's dangerous state of disrepair. But here now, in this place where they had nothing, it felt different. It was an anomaly, an imperfection in the pattern of decay. A question mark on the floor. Helen's exhaustion was momentarily pushed aside by a faint, unfamiliar flicker of curiosity. She knelt down, her knees protesting on the hard wood, and touched the raised edge. It wiggled under her fingers. It wasn't just loose, it was completely detached on one end. A cold knot of apprehension and intrigue formed in her stomach. "Let's see," she murmured, more to herself than to Leo. Together, they began to claw away the remaining rotten hay from around the board. The material was dense and fibrous, fused together by moisture and time. It broke apart in foul-smelling chunks. The air grew thick with the scent of mold and wet earth, a smell so potent it made Helen's eyes water. As they cleared a larger area, they could see the full length of the plank. It was darker than the wood around it, as if it had been soaked in something long ago. It was a single, deliberate piece in a puzzle of random decay. Why was this one board loose when the others were either rotted through or nailed fast? The question echoed in the silent barn. Helen felt her heart begin to beat a little faster, a steady thump, thump, thump against her ribs. For the first time since they had arrived, her focus shifted from the overwhelming misery of her surroundings to a single, concentrated point of mystery. Something was under there. She needed a tool, a lever. Her gaze swept the gloomy interior, searching for anything she could use. Near the entrance, where she had dropped it hours ago, was the heavy case of her sewing machine, but next to it, half buried in the weeds, was something else. A long, rust-pocked tire iron, its curved end a dark crescent in the gloom. It must have been left behind decades ago, a forgotten remnant of whatever vehicles had once used this barn. She retrieved it, the cold, heavy metal feeling solid and purposeful in her hand. Returning to the loose board, she wedged the flat end of the tire iron into the crack. "Stand back, sweetie," she warned Leo, her voice tight with anticipation. She put her weight on the tool, pushing down. At first, nothing happened. Then came a low, groaning complaint from the wood, the sound of ancient nails resisting their eviction from the joists below. The sound was shockingly loud, a violent tearing in the deep quiet. With a final splintering shriek, the board gave way, popping up and flipping over. Helen and Leo both flinched back. They peered into the dark cavity revealed beneath. It wasn't deep, just a narrow space between the floor joists, filled with dirt, cobwebs, and the desiccated husks of dead insects. A wave of disappointment washed over Helen. It was nothing, just more dirt. Her brief flicker of hope felt foolish, a childish fantasy. She was about to drop the tire iron, to accept the crushing reality again, when Leo pointed. "Mom, look!" His voice was a hushed whisper. Her eyes followed his small finger. There, nestled in the dark soil, almost completely obscured, was a small object. It wasn't a rock or a piece of wood. It had a dull metallic sheen, catching the faint ambient light from the dying day outside. It was something made, something lost. A jolt, like a low-voltage electrical current, shot up Helen's arm. Her hand trembled as she reached into the dark, dusty space. Her fingers brushed against the object, and a surprising coldness radiated into her skin. It was metal. She pinched it between her thumb and forefinger and pulled it out of the dirt. She brought it close to her face, trying to make it out in the near darkness. It was small, maybe 1.5 inches long, and heavy for its size. It was crusted with dirt and a greenish-blue layer of oxidation, but she could feel a shape beneath the grime. It seemed to be a pin of some kind with a sharp point on the back. She rubbed it vigorously against the fabric of her jeans, the rough denim scraping away decades of accumulated filth. As the dirt fell away, a design began to emerge. It was a crest, an intricate shape involving an eagle and a shield, though the details were worn and hard to decipher. It was a service pin, an official-looking pin, and it was completely, utterly out of place. Helen stared at the pin in her palm, the last vestiges of twilight glinting off the newly exposed metal. 1,000 questions exploded in her mind at once. Who did this belong to? Why was it hidden here, under the floor of this derelict barn? It wasn't treasure, not in the way she had dared to hope for, but it was something far more potent, a story, a secret. For 6 months, her world had been a suffocating fog of grief and poverty, a daily struggle for the most basic survival. But this small and cold piece of metal was a crack in that wall of despair. It was a clue. The word itself felt foreign and exciting. It implied a puzzle to be solved, a path to be followed. The gnawing ache of hunger in her stomach, the deep chill in her bones, the overwhelming weight of her failure, all of it receded for a moment, replaced by a sharp, electrifying jolt of purpose. Her mind, so long numbed by trauma, felt like it was waking up. She closed her hand around the pin, the sharp edges of the crest digging into her palm. The physical sensation grounded her, focusing her thoughts. This pin wasn't dropped by accident. It was hidden, deliberately placed under a specific, loosened floorboard. And if someone went to the trouble of hiding this, what else might they have hidden? The disappointment she had felt just moments before was now replaced by a frantic, surging hope that felt both exhilarating and dangerous. It was a wild gamble, a shot in the absolute dark, but it was infinitely better than the suffocating certainty of their ruin. She looked from the pin in her hand to the empty space where she had found it, then to the floorboard surrounding it. Her gaze sharpened, no longer seeing just a field of rot, but a map that she needed to learn how to read. The barn was no longer just a tomb. It was a treasure chest. And she had just found the keyhole. "There has to be more," she whispered, the words hanging in the cold air. The pin was the start, not the end. It was a signpost. Her exhaustion was gone, burned away by a sudden flood of adrenaline that made her feel clear-headed and strangely powerful. She was no longer a victim collapsing in a ruin. She was an investigator at a scene. She handed the pin to Leo, who held it with a reverence usually reserved for his favorite toys. "Hold this for me, sweetie. Don't lose it." His eyes were wide, sensing the dramatic shift in his mother's demeanor. He nodded solemnly, his fear replaced by a shared sense of clandestine excitement. Helen picked up the tire iron again. The tool no longer felt like a random piece of junk. It now felt like an extension of her will, a weapon against the secrets this barn had held for so long. She knelt again, her eyes scanning the planks around the hole with a forensic intensity. The darkness was becoming a problem. The last glow had faded from the gaps in the walls, plunging the barn into a profound blackness that was nearly absolute. The only light was the weak silvery sliver of a crescent moon, which did little to penetrate the gloom. Helen's heart sank. To be so close to something, only to be stopped by the simple absence of light, was a unique form of torture. Then she remembered her phone. She had been conserving its precious battery, but this was an emergency of a different kind. She fumbled in her coat pocket, her fingers closing around the cold glass rectangle. She swiped the screen on and activated the flashlight function. A bright, clean cone of white light sliced through the darkness. Startlingly intense, it felt like a miracle. The beam was a sword, cutting away the shadows and revealing the floor in stark, unflattering detail. Now she could truly see. She aimed the powerful beam at the area around the hole, her eyes tracing the lines and grains of the wood. The planks were all in a similar state of decay, stained and warped. It looked like a random mess, but then she saw it. A faint, almost invisible scratch mark on the board just to the left of the one she'd removed, and another on the board to the right. They weren't random marks from a shovel or a pitchfork. They were precise, straight lines, like guide marks a carpenter might make. Her breath hitched. Following these marks, her eyes traced a large rectangle on the floor, about 4 feet long and 3 feet wide. The boards within this rectangle seemed subtly different. The gaps between them were tighter, the patterns of rot less chaotic. It was an island of order in an ocean of decay. It was a door, hidden in plain sight, disguised by filth and time. Her heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic drumbeat of discovery. "Here," she breathed, tracing the outline with her finger for Leo to see. This whole section. The task of prying up a single board had been difficult. Lifting this entire section would be monumental, but the certainty that she was on the right path gave her a strength she didn't know she possessed. She wedged the tire iron into the hairline crack at the edge of the rectangle and pushed with all her might. Her muscles, already strained from the journey and the earlier effort, screamed in protest. A sharp pain shot through her back. The wood groaned, but it held fast. It was sealed shut, fused by decades of rust and damp. For a moment, she felt a surge of despair. To find the door and be unable to open it would be the cruelest joke of all. "Help me." "Leo," she grunted, her voice strained. "Push with me." He placed his small hands next to hers on the iron bar, and they pushed together, a desperate, unified force against the stubborn past. There was a loud crack that echoed through the barn like a gunshot. It wasn't the sound of splintering wood, but of rusted metal finally surrendering. The entire rectangular section shifted, lifting by half an inch along one side. A puff of ancient, stale air escaped from the gap, carrying a smell she had never encountered before. It was the scent of trapped time itself, dry, dusty, and utterly devoid of life or moisture, like the air from a long-sealed tomb. It was completely different from the damp, mildewed odor of the barn. Hope, fierce and wild, surged through her. They had done it. They had broken the seal. She worked the tire iron around the edge, breaking more of the hidden hinges or nails that held it in place. With each snap, the section became looser. Finally, she was able to get her fingers underneath one edge of the makeshift door. It was heavy, made of thick, double-layered planks. It was built to last. It was built to hide something important. As she lifted, she saw it. A dark, rusted iron ring, set flush into the wood, now visible in the gap. A handle. It was real. This was all real. A giddy, hysterical laugh almost escaped her lips, but she choked it back down. This was no time to lose control. She propped the section open with the tire iron, widening the gap enough to get a proper grip on the recessed handle. The iron was cold and rough against her skin. "Ready?" she asked Leo, her voice a tense whisper. He nodded, his eyes fixed on the handle, wide with a mixture of fear and awe. She took a deep, steadying breath, the stale, dry air filling her lungs. She gripped the ring with both hands, planted her feet, and pulled. Her back and arms strained, the muscles bunching and burning. The door resisted, scraping against its frame, groaning as if in agony at being disturbed after so many silent years. It was a battle of wills, her desperate need against its long inertia. With a final, deafening shriek of protesting wood and rusted metal, the trapdoor swung upward on a hidden hinge and fell back against the floor with a heavy boom that shook the ground beneath them. The sound was swallowed by the vast emptiness of the barn, leaving a ringing silence in its wake. Helen scrambled back, pulling Leo with her, her heart pounding in her throat. She shone her phone's light into the opening. It revealed a perfect square of absolute, impenetrable blackness. It was a hole, a moor leading down into the belly of the earth beneath the barn. No ladder was visible, no steps, just a dark, silent void. A primal fear, cold and immediate, washed over her. What horrors lurked in that darkness? Snakes? Spiders? A collapsed well? The giddy excitement was instantly tempered by a healthy dose of terror. For a moment, she considered slamming the door shut, pretending they had never found it. But she couldn't. The mystery was too powerful. "Stay here," she ordered Leo, her voice firm. "Do not come near the edge." She knelt by the opening, the phone held out in a shaky hand. The beam of light seemed to be eaten by the darkness, unable to find a bottom. "Hello?" she called out, her voice trembling slightly. The sound fell into the hole and was simply gone. There was no echo, no reply, only a profound, unnerving silence that seemed to push back at her. She took a loose piece of splintered wood and dropped it in. She waited, her ears straining, for the sound of it hitting the bottom. 1 second, 2 seconds. Thud. The sound was soft. Close. It wasn't a deep well. Her heart, which had climbed into her throat, settled back into her chest. She angled the phone's light downwards again, leaning precariously over the edge. Now she could see it. The bottom was only about 3 or 4 feet down, and the hole wasn't just dirt. The walls were lined with old dark red bricks. It wasn't a hole. It was a compartment, a vault, a desperate plan formed in her mind. It was shallow enough to get into, but getting out might be difficult. She couldn't risk getting trapped. She looked around and her eyes landed on a thick, sturdy-looking rope coiled in a corner, miraculously preserved from the worst of the decay. It was probably once used for hoisting hay bales. Testing its strength, she found it solid. She tied one end securely around a thick, load-bearing roof support post, the knot one Mark had taught her long ago for camping, a memory that brought a sharp, sudden pang. She dropped the other end into the hole. It was time. A tremor of fear and anticipation ran through her. "I'm going down," she told Leo. "I'll be right back. You watch the rope." She swung her legs into the opening, her feet finding the rope. The air from the compartment was cold and smelled of dust, rust, and something else. Old paper. Taking one last look at her son's worried face, she lowered herself into the darkness. Her feet touched the solid, earthen floor. She was in. The space was tight, no more than 4 feet square, a brick-lined crypt. The air was frigid and utterly still. She shone the phone's light around the small chamber. The brickwork was old, but professional. This was built with intention, built to hide something from the world. And there, sitting squarely in the middle of the dirt floor, were the objects of her frantic search. 2 of them. They weren't chests of wood and brass like in storybooks. They were plain, functional, metal boxes, like military footlockers or large ammunition cans. Both were covered in a thick layer of rust that flaked away like red dust under the beam of her light. They looked ancient, menacing, and full of secrets. A wave of dizziness washed over her, the reality of the moment almost too much to bear. She had been right. She had followed the clues, and they had led her here, to this. The answer to all her problems, or the beginning of new and more terrifying ones. Her hands, shaking uncontrollably, reached for the first box. It was larger than the other, and when she tried to slide it, it barely budged. It was immensely heavy. A frantic, desperate strength surged through her. Grunting with effort, she dragged the box directly under the opening. The clasps were rusted solid, but the tire iron, which she had tucked into her waistband, made short work of them. With a screech of tortured metal, she pried one open, then the other. Her heart was a wild drum against her ribs. She paused, her hand hovering over the lid. This was the moment that would change everything. Taking a shuddering breath, she lifted the lid. The phone's light poured inside, and for a second she was blinded. The light didn't just illuminate the contents, it was captured and thrown back, multiplied into 100 points of a warm, dazzling, impossible glow. She gasped, her breath catching in her throat. The box was filled almost to the brim with small rectangular bars of gold. It was a sight so far beyond the realm of possibility that her mind struggled to process it. Gold, not coins, not jewelry, but solid ingots, each one stamped with a weight and purity mark. They were stacked neatly, a king's ransom buried in the dirt beneath a ruined barn. Tucked alongside the gold bars were thick, tight bundles of cash, US dollars. The bills were old, the portraits smaller than she was used to, but they were undeniably real. The paper bands around them were brittle and yellowed with age. Helen felt a wave of nausea and vertigo sweep over her, and she had to place a hand against the cold brick wall to steady herself. This wasn't just money. This was a fortune. Enough to solve every problem she had, and 1,000 she hadn't even thought of yet. It was salvation in a rusty metal box. The sheer overwhelming relief was so powerful, it felt like a physical blow, and a sob of disbelief escaped her lips. After a long moment of staring, her eyes wide and unblinking, she forced herself to turn her attention to the second box. It was smaller, lighter. Her initial elation was now mixed with a sense of deep foreboding. The gold and cash were the what. This second box, she sensed, was the why. The clasps on this one were less stubborn. It opened with a soft, metallic sigh. The smell that emerged was the one she had faintly detected from above, the dry, slightly sweet scent of old paper and aging leather. There were no riches inside. Instead, the box contained just 2 items. The first was a thick, black, leather-bound book, a diary. Its cover was worn smooth at the edges, and the pages were yellowed and dense with faded, spidery handwriting. The second item was a thick manila envelope, surprisingly well preserved in the dry air of the vault. It felt heavy and stiff. Her fingers, still trembling, unbent the metal clasp, and tilted the envelope open. A cascade of small, translucent rectangles slid into her palm. Photo negatives. Dozens of them, each one a dark, ghostly reversal of an unknown scene. She held one up to the phone's light, but the inverted image of shadowed figures in a stark room told her nothing. They were a mystery within a mystery. She turned her attention back to the diary, opening it to a random page. The ink was a faded blue-black, the handwriting precise and disciplined. She read a few lines. The subject proved resistant. Thompson authorized enhanced methods. The information was secured by O300, another victory for the program, but the methods weigh on me. Thompson. The name meant nothing to her, but the words, they were chilling. Subject, enhanced methods. This wasn't the diary of a farmer. She flipped to the inside cover. In elegant, looping script was a name, Arthur Miller, her husband's granduncle. A cold dread, more profound than any fear she had felt before, settled in her stomach. The gold was not a gift. It was a secret, a dark, dirty, and dangerous one. Back in the suffocating gloom of the barn, Helen used the rope to climb out of the secret compartment, her body aching, her mind a chaotic storm. She left the heavy boxes of gold and cash below, but she clutched the leather-bound diary and the envelope of negatives as if they were a lifeline. She slammed the heavy trapdoor shut, the boom echoing the finality of her discovery. The dust settled. She sat on the filthy floor, pulling Leo close. The oppressive cold of the barn was nothing compared to the chill seeping into her from the pages in her lap. She aimed her phone's weak light onto the inside cover, her finger tracing the faded, elegant script. Arthur Miller, her husband's granduncle. With a trembling hand, she turned to the first dated entry, a lifetime ago in the early 1970s. The dense, spidery handwriting waited to give up its ghosts, and Helen felt a profound sense of trespassing, of uncovering a truth that had fought to stay buried in the dark, cold earth. She read the first few entries in a hushed, horrified whisper, the words meant only for Leo's sleeping ears. Arthur Miller wrote with the crisp, fervent idealism of a young man on a mission. He described his pride at being selected for a special task force within the FBI, a unit operating under the direct command of a charismatic and ruthless superior officer, a man named Thompson. The early pages were filled with patriotic zeal, a genuine belief that they were the thin line protecting the nation from enemies within. He wrote of subversive elements and the sacred duty to preserve the American way of life. The words felt alien, from a different, harsher time. Helen felt a knot of dread tighten in her stomach. This was not the simple journal of a farmer. It was the confidential field log of a federal agent, and she knew, with a certainty that chilled her to the core, that its secrets were not going to be noble ones. The name of the operation appeared again and again, a drumbeat of official menace, COINTELPRO. The acronym was vaguely familiar, a ghost from a history textbook, but Arthur's words gave it flesh and blood. He chronicled their mandate to infiltrate, disrupt, and neutralize domestic political organizations, anti-war movements, student activist groups, civil rights leaders. They were all targets. The language in the diary was cold, clinical, and terrifyingly detached. He never used words like people. He used words like subjects, assets, and targets. Helen felt a wave of nausea. The air in the barn, already thick with the stench of decay, now seemed heavy with the smell of old lies and buried crimes. This book in her hands was not history. It was a confession she was now implicated in, simply by virtue of knowing. The weight of it pressed down on her, a physical pressure on her chest. A few months into the diary, the tone began to change, the crisp certainty fraying at the edges. Arthur started describing what he called Thompson's off-the-books initiatives. She read one passage, her blood running cold. Thompson is convinced the movement is bankrolled by wealthy sympathizers. He has engineered a method to seize those assets, not for the Bureau, but for program continuity. His words. He calls it discretionary forfeiture. There are no warrants, no records. The entire process feels irregular. That word, irregular, was underlined 3 times, a small act of rebellion on the page. The idealistic young agent was gone, replaced by a man becoming aware that the line between lawman and criminal had been completely erased. Helen could feel his dawning horror bleeding through the ink, a terror that now, 50 years later, was becoming her own. The diary devolved into a sickening ledger of criminality. With a detached precision that made Helen's skin crawl, Arthur detailed Thompson's monstrous system. They would abduct activists without due process, holding them incommunicado in safe houses, far from the eyes of the law. Then Thompson, the charming and powerful officer, would approach their terrified families or financial backers. He would offer a simple, illegal transaction, a substantial donation in gold or untraceable cash in exchange for the immediate release and wiped slate of their loved one. The gold bars shimmering beneath her feet were not a lost family treasure. They were ransom payments. The stacks of cash were the price of freedom, extorted from desperate people by a man who had sworn an oath to protect them. Helen felt a bile of disgust rise in her throat. The fortune that had promised her a future was the spoils of a brutal, hidden war. Her eyes fell on an entry from the following year, and her breath caught. "A great honor today," Arthur wrote. "Thompson gave me his old service pin, a commendation for my loyalty and effectiveness. It felt heavy in my hand, but not with pride. It felt heavy with the weight of our sins. I see the fear in the subject's eyes, and I no longer see the enemy. I see teachers, students, fathers. I see myself." Helen glanced at the small metal crest that Leo now clutched as he slept, his own good luck charm. It wasn't a clue to a treasure. It was a medal for extortion, a token passed from the master of the crime to his troubled apprentice. The name Thompson was no longer just a word on a page. He was a real person, the true owner of this bloody fortune, and this pin was his calling card, a small piece of him left behind in the dark. The final pages of the diary were a descent into paranoia and fear. The handwriting grew frantic, the neat lines becoming a desperate scrawl. Arthur wrote of his plan to take his share of the fortune and disappear. "Thompson watches me now. He knows I'm keeping records. He sees the doubt in my eyes. I must get out. The boat to Argentina leaves in 2 days. This blood money is my only ticket to a new life, my only escape from him." The very last entry was short, abrupt and utterly chilling. "A strange tightness in my chest all day. The stress, I suppose. I need to rest before I move the boxes to the car. Just a few minutes." And the writing stopped. He never made it to the car, Helen realized with a jolt. He died right here, in this barn, his heart giving out, leaving his secret and Thompson's fortune buried and waiting. Helen snapped the diary shut, the sound unnaturally loud in the silent barn. The story was complete. A perfect, horrifying circle of greed, fear, and death. The gold was not hers. It belonged to the ghosts of people terrorized by their own government. And Thompson, the man behind it all, was still out there. A man who built a fortune on extortion would not simply forget about it. For 40 years, he must have wondered, searched, waited. The fear that coiled in her gut was colder and sharper than any poverty she had ever known. This wasn't just about survival anymore. This was about a secret that people were killed for. She quickly stuffed the diary and the negatives deep into her bag, alongside a single, heavy gold bar. It wasn't treasure, it was evidence. With trembling muscles, she pushed the heavy trapdoor back into place, burying the glittering fortune once more, hoping to bury the danger with it. The sun rose, but it brought no comfort. Its light, streaming through the holes in the roof, now seemed accusatory, illuminating the scene of a crime. The knowledge of what lay just a few feet beneath the rotten floorboards had transformed the space. The barn was no longer a dilapidated shelter. It was a powder keg, and she and Leo were sleeping on top of it. Every creak of the old wood, every gust of wind, sent a fresh jolt of terror through her. The isolation she had lamented was now a suffocating blanket of vulnerability. Who could she tell? Who would believe a destitute widow over a powerful, decorated federal agent? Late in the afternoon, as the shadows began to lengthen, she heard it. A low, unfamiliar rumble, the sound of an engine, moving slowly, deliberately, down the dirt track that was supposed to be forgotten by the world. Her heart hammered against her ribs. They were no longer alone. A car emerged from the overgrown path, and Helen's blood went cold. It was a late-model Lincoln, its black paint polished to a mirror shine, utterly alien in the landscape of rust and decay. It crawled to a stop, the engine humming with a quiet, expensive power. The driver's side door opened, and a man stepped out. He was tall and lean, perhaps approaching 80, but he held himself with the rigid posture of a lifelong military man. He wore tailored grey slacks, a crisp white shirt, and polished loafers, his silver hair perfectly combed. He moved with a chilling economy of motion, his gaze sweeping across the ruin, his sharp blue eyes taking in every detail. They scanned the broken walls, the sagging roof, and then they landed on Helen. She felt pinned by his stare, like a moth under glass. This man radiated a cold, absolute authority, an aura of power that felt ancient and unbreakable. She instinctively grabbed Leo, pulling him behind her. He walked towards them, his expensive shoes making no sound on the weed-choked ground. "I must say, I'm surprised to find this place occupied," he began, his voice a smooth, cultured baritone that dripped with condescension. He stopped a few feet away, a thin, humorless smile playing on his lips. "Walter Thompson," he announced, as if she should know the name. "My estate borders this little scrap of land." Helen felt the air leave her lungs. Thompson, the name from the diary. The monster from the past. He was real. He was old, and he was standing right in front of her. A wave of dizziness made the world tilt, and she gripped Leo's shoulder to keep from falling. The man in her husband's granduncle's nightmares was here, drawn by some unseen force, sniffing around the edges of his long-lost crime. The past was not dead. It wasn't even past. "I heard a rumor someone was camping out in the old Miller barn," Thompson continued, his cold eyes flicking over Helen's worn coat and Leo's frightened face. The look was not one of pity, but of pure contempt, as if he'd found vermin in his pantry. "This structure is a public menace, a fire hazard, frankly, an eyesore." He paused, letting his assessment hang in the air. "But it seems it's your lucky day. I'm in a generous mood." He reached into the inner pocket of his blazer and produced a checkbook and a fountain pen with an elegant, unhurried motion. The gesture was so theatrical, so dismissive, it made Helen's skin crawl. He was not negotiating. He was swatting a fly. He was a king in his own kingdom, and she was nothing but a peasant trespassing on his memory. His eyes never left hers as he spoke. "I am prepared to offer you $500, a charitable donation, you might say, for the trouble of clearing out. You sign a simple quitclaim deed. I take possession of this worthless property, and you can be on your way to a better life. $500. The words were a slap in the face. For land that concealed a fortune, for a secret he would kill to protect. The sheer, breathtaking arrogance of the man was its own kind of violence. The fear in her throat was a hard, solid knot, but beneath it, a hot, unfamiliar rage began to smolder. The memory of her husband's accident, Arthur's terrified final words, the decades of injustice. It all coalesced into a single point of fiery resistance. This man would not win. Not again. Summoning a strength she didn't know she possessed, Helen looked him directly in the eye. "It's not for sale," she said. Her voice was thin, reedy, barely more than a whisper, but it cut through the afternoon quiet with the finality of a slamming door. Thompson's practiced smile did not falter, but she saw a flicker of something in his icy blue eyes. Surprise. Annoyance. "This was my husband's family land," she added, her voice gaining a sliver of strength. "We're staying." Her words, a pathetic defiance against this giant of a man, hung in the air. For the first time, she wasn't just a victim of circumstance. She had made a choice. She had drawn a line in the dirt, and she could feel the ground trembling beneath her feet from the sheer weight of her decision. She was no longer just protecting herself. She was protecting the truth. The thin smile on Thompson's face finally dissolved, replaced by a mask of cold, reptilian stillness. The air temperature seemed to drop by 10 degrees. He didn't shout. He didn't argue. The quiet that fell was infinitely more menacing. "A sentimental attachment," he said, his voice dropping to a low, silken whisper that was more dangerous than any roar. "Their foolish liability." His gaze drifted away from her, making a slow, deliberate tour of the dilapidated barn, lingering on the tinder-dry wood and the overgrown grass, baked brittle by the sun. Then his eyes snapped back, not to her, but to her son, Leo, who was peeking out from behind her legs. "We're in a very dry season," Thompson said, his voice suddenly conversational again, the effect utterly chilling. Fires are such common accidents in abandoned places. It would be a terrible, terrible tragedy. He held her gaze for 1 second longer, letting the naked threat settle deep into her bones. He was not making an offer for the land, he was giving her a final warning. Then, with a curt nod, he turned his back on her, walked silently to his gleaming black car, and drove away, the sound of the engine fading into the vast, indifferent landscape. Helen stood paralyzed, the man's final words echoing in her mind. He was going to kill them. He would burn the barn to the ground to destroy the last link to his crime, and she and her son were nothing but acceptable collateral damage. The gold beneath her feet was no longer a ticket to freedom. It was the bait in a trap that had just snapped shut. She was caught between a monster and a fortune built on ghosts. What would you do? Would you take the evidence and the dirty money and run, disappearing into the night to save your child? Or would you stay and fight for justice, knowing it could cost you everything you have left in the world? Fear was a physical presence in the barn, a cold, heavy gas pressing down on Helen's chest. Thompson's words echoed in the oppressive silence, not as a memory but as a prophecy hanging in the air. Fires are such common accidents. The threat was so stark, so devoid of artifice, that it left no room for doubt. She could almost smell the phantom scent of gasoline on the dry, dusty air, could almost hear the future crackle of flames consuming the tinder-dry wood of the walls. Every gust of wind, moaning through the gaps in the structure, sounded like the whisper of an approaching match. She looked at Leo, who had fallen into an exhausted sleep on a pile of their few belongings, his small chest rising and falling with an innocence that was about to be burned away. The terror was no longer a vague anxiety. It was a sharp, specific certainty. He was coming for them. The thought was a shard of ice in her gut, and she knew, with a clarity that eclipsed all other sensations, that they could not survive another night in this place. She couldn't stay, but where could she possibly go? The question was a solid wall in her mind. They were miles from anywhere, with no vehicle and barely enough money for a single meal. Returning to the city meant homelessness, a slow, anonymous decay on the streets. Staying here meant a swift, violent death by fire. She felt like a trapped animal, presented with two different doors to the same abattoir. The gold and cash buried beneath her feet were a cruel taunt. It was a king's ransom that she couldn't spend, a key to a world she couldn't reach without first crossing a river of fire guarded by a monster. The weight of her responsibility for Leo was crushing. It was one thing to fail him by being poor. It was another entirely to lead him into the crosshairs of a murderer. A cold, hard resolve began to form beneath the layers of her fear. She would not let her son become collateral damage in a story that began before he was born. She had to move. She had to find a way out. Now, a memory surfaced, faint but persistent. The weathered farmer at the roadside stand, the one who had pointed them down this forgotten path. His eyes, crinkling with a mixture of pity and curiosity. What had he said? Ain't nobody been out there in my lifetime, except old man Jeffries on the next patch over. He's been here forever. At the time, the words had been nothing more than rustic color. Now, they were a lifeline, a name. Mr. Jeffries, a neighbor. It was a desperate, flimsy straw to grasp at, but it was the only straw she had. To go to a complete stranger, to trust him with a story so insane it sounded like the ravings of a madwoman, it was a terrifying gamble. But Thompson had shown his hand. He believed she was a nobody, a piece of trash to be swept away and forgotten. Her only advantage was that he underestimated her. Her only hope was that someone else wouldn't. The sun was beginning its descent, painting the sky in fiery hues that felt like a terrible omen. She had to go. Her movements became swift and deliberate, fueled by a new, frantic energy. Panic was a luxury she could no longer afford. Only action mattered now. She grabbed the small, worn backpack they had used to carry their few clothes. Her hands trembled as she began to pack, her mind racing to prioritize the artifacts of her new, terrifying reality. She took the leather-bound diary, its secrets feeling dense and heavy. She carefully placed the manila envelope of photo negatives beside it. She wrapped the single gold bar she had taken from the vault in a spare shirt, the weight of it a solid, dangerous lump at the bottom of the bag. The service pin, Thompson's calling card, went into a side pocket, its sharp point a constant reminder of the man they were fleeing. She added their only bottle of water and the last of their crackers. It was a preposterous survival kit, the evidence of a federal crime, a bar of blood money and a child's snack. This bag was their entire world, their only weapon and their greatest liability. Leo, wake up, sweetie. She gently shook her son's shoulder, forcing a calm into her voice that she did not feel. The lie felt like sandpaper in her throat. We're going to go for a little walk. See the sunset. Leo blinked, his eyes blurry with sleep and confusion. But it's getting dark, Mom. His simple, logical statement was a dagger to her heart. She was about to lead him out into the encroaching night, into a wilderness populated by at least one monster. I know, she said, her smile feeling brittle, like a mask about to crack. It's an adventure, come on. She hoisted the heavy backpack onto her shoulders, the weight of it a grim reassurance. It was real. This was happening. As they stepped out of the barn, the long, distorted shadows thrown by the setting sun seemed to writhe on the ground, reaching for them like grasping fingers. The barn, which had been their prison, now felt like the only solid thing in a world that was dissolving into a terrifying, uncertain twilight. They walked quickly, not on the dirt track where Thompson's car had appeared, but through the tall, overgrown grass of the fields, heading in the direction the farmer had indicated, the adjacent farm. Every step was an exercise in terror. The rustling of a field mouse in the dry grass sounded like the cocking of a gun. The hoot of a distant owl felt like a warning. Helen's senses were on fire, her ears straining for the rumble of an engine, her eyes scanning the horizon for the glint of headlights. She held Leo's hand in a grip so tight it was almost painful, her own fear a palpable current flowing between them. The sun had dipped below the horizon now, leaving the world in a wash of deep blue and purple twilight. The beauty of it was a cruel joke, a painted backdrop for their desperate flight. She had no idea if this Mr. Jeffries was even home, or if he would listen, or if he would simply turn them away. She was running on the fumes of a half-remembered conversation and blind hope. After what felt like an eternity of walking through the rapidly darkening fields, she saw it, a single point of warm, yellow light. It was a porch light, a beacon of impossible normalcy in the vast, intimidating darkness of the countryside. It illuminated a small, white clapboard house, impeccably neat, with a manicured lawn and a tidy garden. This was a place of order and peace, a world away from the chaos and decay she had just fled. As they drew closer, she could smell the sweet scent of honeysuckle from a trellis on the porch. For a moment, the sheer domesticity of it all paralyzed her. How could she possibly bring her nightmare story to this doorstep? How could she shatter this peaceful world with her tale of murder, extortion, and buried gold? Doubt, cold and sharp, flooded her. She should turn back, run, disappear into the night. But then she felt Leo's small hand tremble in hers, and she knew there was no turning back. This was their only chance. Taking a deep, shuddering breath, Helen walked up the 3 wooden steps to the porch. The wood was solid under her feet, a stark contrast to the rotten planks of the barn. She stood before the front door for a long moment, her heart hammering against her ribs so hard she felt dizzy. The simple act of raising her hand to knock felt monumental, like pushing a boulder uphill. This was the moment of commitment. Once she knocked, the story would be out. It would be real. It could no longer be contained in her own terrified mind. She squeezed her eyes shut, said a silent prayer to a God she wasn't sure she believed in anymore, and knocked. The sound, 3 sharp raps, was deafening in the country quiet. It echoed into the night, announcing their presence, their desperation. They waited. A light flickered on inside. She heard the slow, shuffling sound of footsteps approaching the door, followed by the dry, cautious voice of an old man. "Who's there?" The door creaked open a few inches, held by a brass security chain. A sliver of a man appeared in the gap. He was small and wiry, his face a roadmap of wrinkles, but the eyes that peered out at her were sharp and shockingly blue, missing nothing. He took in her disheveled appearance, the wild fear in her eyes, the tired, pale face of the small boy clinging to her leg, and the backpack that seemed to weigh her down like a stone. He saw it all in a single, sweeping glance. "Can I help you?" he asked, his voice not unkind but cautious. This was clearly a man who had lived a long time, and had learned that nothing good usually came knocking after dark. Helen's own voice was a dry croak, caught in her throat. "Mr. Jeffries," she managed to whisper. "My name is Helen Miller. My husband was Mark Miller. I need your help. Please, we're in terrible trouble." The name Miller made the old man's eyes widen almost imperceptibly. He unlatched the chain and opened the door. Once inside, the words tumbled out of Helen in a frantic, disjointed torrent. Standing in the small, tidy entryway, she spilled the entire horrifying story, from the eviction in the city to the false hope of the barn, to the shocking discovery of the secret compartment. Her voice cracked and her hands shook as she described the gold, the cash, the diary, and the man who had come to claim it all. Leo stood silently beside her, clutching her leg, his eyes wide as he listened to his mother recount the nightmare they were living. Mr. Jeffries listened patiently, his expression unreadable, his head tilted slightly, as if trying to assemble the pieces of a complex and disturbing puzzle. He didn't interrupt. He just let her talk, letting the poison of the secret drain out of her until she was left breathless and trembling in the middle of his warm, quiet living room, the whole ugly truth finally laid bare between them. The silence that followed was heavy with the weight of her confession. "You found what?" Mr. Jeffries finally asked, his voice a low rumble of disbelief. Helen didn't answer with words. She slid the heavy backpack from her shoulders and onto the floor with a dull thud. She knelt, unzipped the main compartment, and pulled out the old service pin. Her hand trembled as she held it out to him. "This was hidden first," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "Under a loose floorboard?" The moment Mr. Jeffries' eyes focused on the small metal object in her palm, a profound change came over him. All the color drained from his face, leaving his weathered skin a pasty, sickly gray. His hand, gnarled with age, flew to his mouth, and he took a shaky step back, steadying himself on the arm of a wingback chair. "My God," he breathed, the words fogged with a horror that was decades old. "I haven't seen one of those since Arthur was alive." He stared at the pin as if it were a venomous snake, a ghost from a past he had tried very hard to forget. His reaction was all the confirmation Helen needed. "Come in, sit down, both of you," Mr. Jeffries said, his voice regaining a measure of strength, now laced with a new urgency. He led them from the entryway into a cozy living room. The air was warm and smelled comfortingly of old books, lemon furniture polish, and the faint, sweet aroma of pipe tobacco. Bookshelves crammed with worn paperbacks lined the walls. A fire was dying in the hearth, its embers casting a soft, orange glow. It was a sanctuary, a small pocket of peace and order that felt like it belonged to another universe entirely. The contrast with the cold, stinking decay of the barn was so stark it made Helen feel dizzy. For a fleeting moment, she felt an overwhelming sense of safety. A feeling so foreign she had almost forgotten what it was like. Mr. Jeffries guided her to a plush armchair and then disappeared into the kitchen, returning moments later with a glass of water for her and a glass of milk for Leo, his movements now brisk and purposeful. He sat down opposite her in a worn leather chair that sighed under his weight. He picked up the pin from the small table where she had placed it, turning it over and over in his wrinkled fingers. "So I was the caretaker on the old Henderson farm next door for 60 years, he began, his voice low and steady. "I knew your husband's whole family. I knew his granduncle, Arthur." He looked up, his sharp eyes locking with hers. Arthur was a strange one. He came back from his government work a different man, quiet, jumped at shadows, always looking over his shoulder. He kept to himself in that barn, which he'd fixed up to live in back then. Said he was writing a book. Now I guess I know what he was really writing. He shook his head slowly, a deep sadness in his eyes. He had seen the edges of this story, had lived alongside its troubled protagonist for years, never knowing the true depth of the darkness he carried with him. The pieces of the puzzle were beginning to connect. "And there was a man," Mr. Jeffries continued, his voice dropping even lower, becoming almost conspiratorial. "A visitor. He'd come late at night, always in a big fancy black car that had no business on these dirt roads. He never came to the house, always went straight to the barn. They'd stay in there for hours." Helen held her breath, her knuckles white as she gripped the arms of the chair. "I only got a good look at him once," Jeffries said, his eyes distant with memory. "He was tall, dressed like he was going to a boardroom meeting in the city. He had this way of looking at you, like he was pricing your soul. Cold eyes like a snake's." He paused, then looked directly at Helen. "Your description of this Mr. Thompson, it's him. I'd stake my life on it. It was him." He was the one visiting Arthur all those years ago. The confirmation sent a fresh wave of ice through Helen's veins. This wasn't a new threat. It was an ancient one, finally returned to collect its due. Helen's voice was hoarse as she described Thompson's visit just hours before. She recounted his insulting offer of $500, the cold contempt in his eyes, and the final, chilling threat about accidental fires. As she spoke, she saw the sadness in Mr. Jeffries's face harden into a grim, angry resolve. The old man's jaw tightened, and the kind eyes that had first greeted her now glinted with a cold fire. "That devil!" he spat, the word filled with a lifetime of suspicion that had finally found its target. He bought up land all over this county, always paid pennies on the dollar, always after some unfortunate accident happened to the previous owners. People were always afraid of him. He had connections, they said, federal connections. No one ever dared to cross him. He leaned forward, his frail body radiating an intense energy. He knows. After 40 years, he knows someone is in that barn. He suspects you've found his secret, and he's come to bury it for good. A heavy silence filled the room, thick with the unsaid horror of it all. Leo, sensing the gravity, had fallen silent, his milk untouched. Then, Helen uttered the words that would change everything. "The police said my husband, Mark, died in a workplace accident at the mill, but his co-workers always said it was suspicious." She looked at Mr. Jeffries, a desperate, unasked question in her eyes. The old man stared at her, his face suddenly ashen again. He stood up so abruptly that his chair scraped loudly against the wood floor. He paced back and forth, one hand rubbing his forehead as if trying to soothe a sudden, terrible headache. "No," he whispered. "Oh, dear God, no." He stopped pacing and turned to face her, his eyes filled with a dawning, unbearable comprehension. "Accident, child." "That was no accident." He took a deep breath. "Just days before he died, Mark came to see me, right here, in this room. He was asking questions about the old barn, about his grand-uncle Arthur." The world tilted on its axis. Mr. Jeffries's words struck Helen with the force of a physical blow, knocking the air from her lungs. "Mark came to see me. He was asking questions." The whispers of his co-workers, the sterile voice of the company man on the phone, the gnawing suspicion she had buried under the weight of her grief, it all slammed into her at once, forming a single, monstrous truth. It wasn't an accident. It was an execution. Her husband, her kind, gentle Mark, hadn't died because of a faulty machine. He was murdered. He had started pulling on the same thread she had just uncovered, and Thompson, the silent partner in the background, had simply cut him loose. The grief that flooded her was no longer the dull ache of loss. It was a fresh, white-hot agony, sharp and unbearable. Tears streamed down her face, but they were not tears of sadness. They were tears of pure, undiluted rage. They had taken her husband. Now they were coming for her son. "That bastard," Mr. Jeffries said, his voice trembling with a fury that matched her own. Mark was a good boy. He was just curious about his family. He must have gotten too close. Thompson must have heard about it and tied up the loose end. The old man's face was a mask of grim determination. The time for caution was over. The game had changed. This was no longer about a historical crime. It was about a fresh murder and the imminent threat of another. "He knows you refused his offer," Jeffries said, his voice now sharp and focused. "He won't just threaten again. A man like that doesn't make idle threats. He will act. Tonight." The certainty in his voice was absolute, chilling. "You cannot go back to that barn. You cannot go to the local police. Thompson owns them. You have to disappear. But you can't just run. Not without the truth." His eyes flickered to the backpack on the floor, the repository of their only hope. A plan began to form in the old man's sharp mind, his years of quiet observation coalescing into a strategy. "My grandson," he said, his voice clipped and urgent. "And he's an investigative journalist, in New York City, a real bulldog. If I call him, he'll believe me. He'll know who to take this to, the right people, federal people Thompson can't control." He looked at Helen, his gaze intense. "But that takes time. He has to get here. You have to survive the night, and we need to be smart." His eyes narrowed in thought. "Thompson thinks you're in the barn. He thinks you're a scared, helpless woman with a child. We're going to use that. He'll come for the boxes and to silence the witness, but you won't be there." He gestured toward the dark window that faced the direction of the Miller property. A cold, dangerous idea was taking shape. A gamble that would risk everything for a chance at justice. It was a terrifying proposition, but it was far better than waiting helplessly for the fire. "There's a weak spot in the back of that barn," Jeffries explained, leaning forward, his voice a low conspiratorial whisper. "The north wall. Arthur used to keep a few planks loose on purpose, to air the place out in the summer. They're held by pegs, not nails. If you know where to push, you can slip right out. He showed me once, a long time ago." He drew a crude map on a napkin, his old hand surprisingly steady. "You have to go back there now, alone. While there's still dark, you have to prepare that escape route. He'll send his men to the front. They'll be loud. They'll be arrogant. When you hear them break down that front door, that's your signal. You and the boy slip out the back and you run here, as fast as you can. Do you understand?" The thought of returning to that place, of being in that death trap alone, sent a wave of pure dread through Helen, but then she saw the image of Mark's smiling face, and her fear was burned away by a cold, hard fury. "Yes," she said, "I understand." Leaving Leo in the warm, safe kitchen with Mr. Jeffries was the hardest thing Helen had ever done. The boy cried, his face crumbling in fear as she prepared to leave. "Don't go, Mommy. The bad man will get you," he sobbed. She knelt and held his small face in her hands. "I will be right back," she promised, her voice a raw whisper. "I am just going to play a trick on the bad man. You stay here and be brave for me." She kissed his forehead, a searing, final feeling gesture, and then she turned and slipped out into the oppressive darkness. The run back to the barn was a gauntlet of terror. The night was moonless now, a blanket of absolute black. She stumbled through the tall grass, her lungs burning, her mind screaming. Every shadow was a man, every sound a footstep. The barn loomed ahead of her, a blacker shape against the black sky, a mausoleum waiting for its next occupants. This was no longer just a ruin. It was her battleground. She slipped through the broken main door, her heart in her throat. The air inside was colder than before, and the silence was profound, expectant. It felt like the barn was holding its breath. Using her phone's flashlight, she hurried to the back wall, her light beam cutting a nervous, trembling path through the darkness. She found the spot Mr. Jeffries had described, her fingers tracing the outlines of the planks. They looked no different from the others. She pushed. Nothing. Panic flared in her chest. Had he been wrong? Was the memory of an old man faulty? She pushed again, harder, throwing her weight against the wall. A low groan, and one of the boards shifted. It was pegged, not nailed. Hope surged. She worked frantically, her fingers raw, prying and pushing, until she had loosened 3 of the long vertical planks, enough to create a gap, a narrow sliver of an opening just wide enough for her and Leo to squeeze through. It led directly out into the dark field behind the barn. The escape route was ready. She didn't linger. The feeling of being watched was overwhelming, a prickling sensation on the back of her neck. She squeezed back through the main door and ran, her feet flying over the uneven ground, her lungs screaming for air. She didn't stop until the warm yellow light of Mr. Jeffries' porch was in sight. She burst through his front door, gasping for breath, and collapsed against it, locking it behind her. "It's done," she panted, her body trembling with adrenaline and exertion. Leo ran to her, wrapping his arms around her waist. Mr. Jeffries gave her a grim, approving nod. "Good girl," he said. "Now, we wait." The waiting was a unique form of torture. They sat in the dark kitchen, Jeffries having turned off all the lights except for a single dim lamp in a back room. The minutes crawled by like hours. The silence was absolute, broken only by the loud ticking of a grandfather clock in the hall and the frantic beating of Helen's own heart. Every tick was a countdown. Then they heard it. At first, it was just a low vibration. A hum felt more than heard, but it grew steadily, resolving itself into the deep, guttural rumble of a heavy engine. Not a sleek Lincoln, but something bigger. A truck. Helen's blood ran cold. She rushed to the kitchen window, which had a clear, dark view across the fields toward her patch of land. A pair of headlights sliced through the blackness, bouncing and weaving as the truck navigated the rough dirt track. They weren't trying to be quiet. They weren't trying to be subtle. This was an act of brute force, of arrogant power. The truck barreled to a stop near the barn. its headlights illuminating the dilapidated structure in a stark, ghostly glare. Helen's breath caught in her throat. Two figures emerged from the cab. They were large, broad-shouldered silhouettes, their features lost in the blinding headlights, and in their hands they carried metal cans that glinted in the light. Gasoline. A sudden, sharp pang of loss, completely illogical and yet overwhelmingly powerful, struck Helen. Her sewing machine. It was still in there, just inside the doorway. The old's heavy singer, her inheritance from her mother, her only tool, her last link to a life of normalcy and simple dreams of making a living with her own two hands. It was the one thing she had managed to save from their old life, a symbol of a future she had hoped to build. Now it would be consumed by the fire, a meaningless casualty in a war she hadn't even known she was fighting. The thought was surprisingly painful, a small personal grief amidst the larger terror, but then she felt Leo press his face into her side, his small body trembling, and the regret vanished, incinerated by a ferocious, primal wave of protective love. The machine was metal and wood. It could be replaced. Her son was everything. Nothing else mattered. The two silhouettes moved with a brutish efficiency. They didn't bother trying the broken door. There was no knock, no call. There was only the sound of a heavy boot kicking against wood, followed by a loud splintering crash that carried across the silent fields. The main door, which had clung precariously to its last hinge, gave way completely, falling inward with a boom. The sound was an act of violation, a final, brutal intrusion. They were in. Helen imagined them stepping into the gloom, their eyes searching the shadows for a terrified woman and her child. She imagined them finding the space empty, their confusion turning to anger. This was the signal, the moment Jeffries had predicted. She felt a grim satisfaction mixed with her terror. They were not there. She had listened. She had acted. She had robbed them of their primary targets. But her body was still rigid with fear, every muscle coiled tight as she waited for what she knew must come next. The men didn't waste any time. Through the dark window, Helen could see the faint, moving beams of their flashlights cutting through the interior of the barn. They were moving quickly, methodically. She watched them splash the contents of their cans along the interior walls, the dark liquid soaking into the ancient dry wood. The acrid smell of gasoline, a scent she had only imagined before, now seemed to drift on the night air, a sickening perfume of imminent destruction. This was real. This was happening. It was not a fever dream. A man, a powerful man, had sent these thugs to incinerate her and her child, to erase them from the world as casually as one would burn trash. The sheer evil of it, the cold-blooded calculus, was almost impossible for her mind to grasp. It was a wickedness that belonged in the pages of a history book, not here in her life, aimed at her son. Her grip on Leo tightened, her knuckles turning white. She had to keep him from seeing this, from having this image burned into his memory forever. A moment later, a small orange flower bloomed in the darkness of the barn's interior. It was a tiny flicker at first, almost beautiful in its isolation, but it was a hungry flower. It grew with astonishing speed, fed by the gasoline and the tinder-dry soul of the old building. Within seconds, the single flicker became a dozen, then 100, until the entire inside of the barn was consumed by a rushing, roaring furnace of orange and yellow light. The fire was a living entity, a ravenous beast roaring its triumph into the night. Flames began to punch through the gaps in the walls and burst through the holes in the roof, great gouts of fire that clawed at the black sky. The heat was so intense that Helen could feel its warmth even from this distance, a wave of heat washing over the cold glass of the window pane. The low roar of the inferno was a constant, terrifying sound, the barn groaning and shrieking as it was devoured from the inside out. This was Thompson's final solution. The two men stepped back out of the maelstrom, their dark shapes silhouetted against the raging fire. They stood for a moment, hands on their hips, watching their work. There was no sense of panic or haste. They were like workmen admiring a completed demolition, their job done. They clearly believed that any evidence and any witnesses were now being rendered into ash and smoke. Satisfied, they turned their backs on the inferno, climbed casually back into their truck, and started the engine. The truck made a slow, deliberate U-turn and rumbled back down the dirt track, its red taillights shrinking into the darkness, leaving the conflagration to finish its work alone. They were gone. The silence they left behind was even more terrifying than the noise, filled now only by the hungry roar of the flames. Helen let out a breath she didn't realize she had been holding, her body slumping against the window frame. Weak with a relief that was indistinguishable from terror, she held Leo tight, turning his face away from the horrifying spectacle, burying it in her coat. But she couldn't look away. She watched as the flames, now free and uncontained, climbed higher and higher, a brilliant, terrible pillar of fire in the dark countryside. The main roof beam groaned, surrendered, and collapsed inward, sending a shower of 1,000,000 incandescent sparks spiraling up into the smoke-filled sky. The barn, the site of her deepest despair and her most incredible discovery, was immolating itself, becoming its own funeral pyre. The fire was destroying her meager shelter, but it was also forging something new inside of her. The fear was still there, a cold stone in her stomach, but it was now surrounded by something harder, hotter, and infinitely more dangerous, a diamond-hard resolve. Thompson hadn't silenced her. He had handed her a weapon. He had tried to burn her alive, and he had failed. She clutched the backpack with the diary and the negatives. It was all she had left, and it was all she needed. In the cold pre-dawn light, the fire had finally died, leaving behind a skeletal ruin that steamed and hissed against the damp air. The smell of smoke and wet ash was thick, clinging to their clothes and hair. Helen stood at Mr. Jeffries's window, Leo asleep in a chair behind her, her eyes fixed on the smouldering ghost of the barn. It was a tomb for her old life, a pyre for her fear. Inside, the old man's voice was a low, urgent murmur on the telephone. "David, it's Grandpa. You need to get on the first flight you can." "No, I'm not crazy. I said it's murder, son. And it's bigger than that. Much bigger." He listened for a moment, his face grim. "Just come. I have evidence. The kind of evidence that buries men and rewrites history. Bring your best recorder, and don't talk to anyone until you get here." He hung up the phone, and in the profound silence that followed, Helen felt the first fragile tremor of a world beginning to shift, a tectonic plate of justice stirring deep beneath the earth. David Jeffries arrived not in a whirlwind of sirens, but in a nondescript rental sedan that crunched quietly on the gravel driveway just after noon. He was nothing like his grandfather. He was younger, sharper, his eyes holding the weary, cynical alertness of a man who trafficked in the world's worst secrets for a living. His movements were economical, his questions precise. He listened to Helen's story without interruption, his expression giving nothing away. Then, in the quiet of the living room, she unzipped the backpack and laid its contents on the coffee table. The diary, the negatives, the heavy, dumb weight of the gold bar. David picked up the diary. His fingers tracing the worn leather, he held a negative up to the light, his eyes narrowing. He didn't express shock or disbelief. Instead, a look of grim, professional hunger came over his face. "My God," he whispered, not in fear, but in awe. "This is it. This is the story." Helen felt a weight lift from her soul, the burden of the secret passing from her hands to his. Within hours, David was gone, the evidence secured in a locked case in his trunk. He drove through the night, not to the local authorities, but straight east toward the seat of power. 2 days later, in a sterile, soundproofed conference room high up in the Robert F. Kennedy Department of Justice building in Washington, D.C., the contents of Helen's backpack were laid out on a polished mahogany table. A stern-faced female prosecutor from the Public Integrity section, a woman known for her tenacity, examined each item. She read passages from Arthur Miller's diary, her expression hardening with each line. She studied the negatives through a loop, the ghostly images of terrified men in a bare room finally giving up their secrets. The single gold bar sat in the middle of the table, a silent, damning witness. This was no longer a local matter, a story of a suspicious fire. This was a deep, historical wound in the nation's integrity. And for the first time in 50 years, it was being taken seriously by people with the power to act. The operation was swift and silent. A team was dispatched from the FBI's Washington field office, a new generation of agents with no ties to the ghosts of COINTELPRO. They moved into the county like a quiet fog, their unmarked sedans and professional demeanor a stark contrast to the familiar local patrol cars. While they began a discreet, parallel investigation into Mark Miller's death at the lumber mill, David's editors at a major national newspaper prepared the story for the front page. The plan was a pincer movement. The story would break, exposing Thompson's past and present crimes to the world, creating a public firestorm that would prevent any political maneuvering or cover-up. At the exact same moment, the federal team, armed with sealed warrants from a federal judge, would move in. Thompson, who had controlled his small kingdom for decades through fear and influence, was about to discover that his power had a very definite and very abrupt limit. The hunter was now the hunted. Walter Thompson was enjoying his morning coffee on the sun-drenched veranda of his sprawling estate, the local paper resting on the table beside him. He felt secure, insulated by wealth and a lifetime of impunity. The faint smell of wood smoke in the air was a satisfying reminder of a problem solved. Then, his eyes caught the headline on the front page of the national paper delivered that morning. The words leapt out at him. COINTELPRO, extortion, Miller Barn. His blood ran cold. The fine porcelain cup slipped from his fingers and shattered on the flagstones. At that exact moment, he heard the sound. The crunch of tires on his private gravel driveway. Not one car, but four. Dark, anonymous sedans. Before he could even rise from his chair, a half-dozen figures in dark suits and windbreakers, emblazoned with FBI, swarmed onto his veranda. Walter Thompson, a calm voice, stated, "You are under arrest." The click of the handcuffs locking around his frail, wrinkled wrists was the loudest sound he had ever heard, the final, metallic punctuation mark on a life of crime. The story exploded into a national scandal. David Jeffries' article, a masterful and damning piece of investigative journalism, was just the beginning. The subsequent arrest of a legendary, decorated federal official for crimes spanning 50 years, from Cold War-era extortion to the recent murder of Mark Miller and the attempted murder of his family, ignited a media firestorm. Thompson's cold, arrogant face was on every television screen, his name a byword for the abuse of power. The buried history of COINTELPRO was unearthed for a new generation, with Arthur Miller's diary providing a chilling, first-hand account. Survivors of Thompson's extortion racket, now elderly themselves, came forward, their voices finally heard after decades of fearful silence. For Helen, watching the news from the safety of Mr. Jeffries' guest room, it was a surreal vindication. She had been a ghost, invisible and powerless. Now her story, though her name was protected, was shaking the very foundations of the world that had tried to crush her. The legal process moved with federal efficiency. Thompson's vast assets, a fortune built on a bedrock of crime, were frozen and seized. Weeks later, Helen received an official, overnighted envelope. Her hands trembled as she opened it. Inside wasn't a check, but a letter from the UES Attorney's Office. It detailed the provisions of federal law concerning asset forfeiture and victim restitution. As the direct victim of Thompson's most recent crimes and the instrumental party in the recovery of illicitly obtained federal assets, she was legally entitled to a substantial reward. The number detailed in the letter made her gasp. The figure so large it seemed unreal. It was a fortune beyond her wildest dreams, but it felt clean, earned through fire and terror. A second document was enclosed, a freshly issued warrant official deed. The title to the Miller land, the worthless property, was now legally and irrevocably hers, free and clear. The paper felt heavier than a gold bar in her hands. It was the weight of justice. 3 months later, the air no longer smelled of mold and decay, but of fresh paint and new beginnings. Helen had bought a small, charming house on a tree-lined street in a quiet town hundreds of miles away. Sunlight streamed through large, clean windows, illuminating the dust-free hardwood floors. In a sun-drenched corner room overlooking a green backyard where Leo's laughter could now be heard, she set up her new sewing studio. She carefully unboxed a brand-new computerized Singer machine, its sleek white body a universe away from the old, heavy black workhorse she had lost in the fire. She threaded a bobbin with bright blue thread, placed a piece of scrap fabric under the needle, and pressed the foot pedal. The machine whirred to life with a quiet, satisfying hum. It wasn't just the sound of a motor, it was the sound of her own life, her own business, her own future, being stitched back together, stronger and more beautiful than before. The terror was finally giving way to peace. The kitchen was warm, filled with the rich, comforting smells of roasted chicken, garlic, and fresh bread. A stark, Beautiful contrast to the memory of a meager soup in a barren apartment. The gnawing ache of hunger was a distant ghost, banished by the reality of a stocked pantry and a full table. Helen placed a golden brown pie on the counter to cool. The table was set for 3. Leo, his cheeks rosy with health, was meticulously explaining the rules of his new favorite video game to Mr. Jeffries, who listened with a smiling, grandfatherly attentiveness. Helen watched them. A scene of such simple and profound peace that it brought a lump to her throat. They were her family, forged in fire and fear. The memory of Mark was a warm, gentle presence, not a sharp pain. This peace, this safety, this was the justice he deserved. Tears welled in her eyes, but for the first time in a long, long time they were tears of pure, unadulterated joy. She was home. They were safe. She had won. Helen's story is a harrowing reminder that sometimes the greatest treasures are not gold, but the truths buried alongside it. It shows that the echoes of history can still be heard in the present, and that the fight for justice, even when it feels hopeless, is never truly over. It began with just $87 and a mother's desperate will to survive, and ended with a monster brought to his knees. The path from the bottom is never easy, but Helen's journey proves that courage isn't the absence of fear. It's taking the next step, even when your legs are shaking. If her incredible story of survival and redemption gripped you, and you believe in the power of truth to overcome darkness, then make sure you subscribe to our channel and click the notification bell. You won't want to miss another story where the secrets of the past collide with the courage of the present.